I feel like underlying your work is a strong, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit emphasis on values and virtues. And clearly, the connection of various Darwinist ideas with racism and sort of as justifying, the exercise of power of the strong over the weak, and sort of losing a virtue like empathy or compassion is something that is very, very prevalent and very that you see coming up over and over again in your work. I wonder, if we take some version of evolutionary theory, it's not one theory, it's a bunch of different theories that we put under that umbrella. If we're going to take it for fact, let's say that some version of evolutionary theory is factually correct. We don't know which one exactly. But if we also are going to take seriously the evolution of human societies to a point where we do have fairly peaceful societies, when you compare with our closest genetic ancestors, for instance, the chimps, at least when it comes to reactive violence, as Richard Wrangham has written about, we seem to be far less violent. We do value things like human dignity and peace, and we do have empathy towards to varying degrees. If we're going to take that fact seriously, I wonder if you've ever considered versions of evolutionary theory that do rationally, at least that are rationally compatible with the evolution of virtues like compassion and empathy and protecting vulnerable peoples and so forth. So I'm thinking, for example, of group selection theory that says that, hey, maybe in the world of individuals, there's this kind of, savage, power struggle, where the strong sort of get the upper hand. But if you had a group where everybody cooperated, that group would have a competitive advantage over a group of ruthless individuals where nobody cooperated. And so I know that it's not unanimous in the community. I know a lot of people, a lot of evolutionary thinkers don't give a lot of weight to group selection theory. But have you ever looked for ways to sort of combine these things kind of rationally? So, for example, a group selection theory would explain, at least in theory, the evolution of traits like empathy and compassion and so forth.
Sure. And of course, Darwin was wrestling with these very same ideas. In fact, Darwin writes quite extensively in his book, The Descent of Man, about morality and the development of morality, because he knew this was going to be one of the things that he was going to be challenged on was, right. Well, if, how did morality get here if, everything just came about through these chance processes? So Darwin did believe in group selection, as you're suggesting, and although that was pretty much supplanted in the middle part of the 20th century with W.D. Hamilton's work, where individual selection came to the fore, it's actually making a little bit of a comeback. There are a few thinkers today that are embracing group selection again, but one of the interesting things about group selection, though, and even in the way you framed it here, is that a lot of the thinkers who did embrace group selection, such as Darwin himself, argued that did produce empathy within a particular group. And so Darwin actually said that the golden rule he thought was a viable moral rule, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Darwin thought that is what we're programmed to do or think. However, Darwin also thought that groups that had this kind of empathy could outcompete other groups who didn't. And one of those ways they outcompeted them, now, okay, there's various ways they could do that. It's not, they could maybe do better at gathering resources and finding food and other kinds of things like that, hunting or other things like that. But also another way that they could outcompete other peoples who had less empathy was by warfare. And so Darwin actually claimed that warfare was a way for people with higher morality, higher levels of empathy and altruism to outcompete people who had less altruism. So you've got this problem of in-group versus out-group competition here too. And so racism could then be interpreted very easily also in the same kind of way that, okay, people within the race may have empathy for each other, but then they have this out-group competition toward those that are lesser. So there's a number of ways to interpret it. You are right, though, that certainly there are a lot of evolutionists today who believe that empathy and altruism, usually altruism is the word that the evolutionary biologists like to use, that altruism has been developed through evolutionary processes because it provides some kind of evolutionary advantage for those people. But I should remark that just because some particular trait, such as altruism, is an evolutionary advantage for some people, does not mean that excludes it from having been designed. Obviously, if it was designed by an intelligent designer, they would want it to, it should have some advantage. So just to show that it has an advantage doesn't necessarily make a slap down on intelligent design. It's just to say that they've tried to propose a way that evolution could have produced it.
Right, and that distinction between in-group and out-group, I think, to a large degree would help explain Richard Wrangham's the goodness paradox, that when it comes to reactive violence, like person-to-person violence in close proximity, we're much less violent than our closest genetic ancestors. But when you look at large-scale war, we're far more violent, right? There's never been anything like, the world wars and so forth. So I think that in-group, out-group, right? You could be super cooperative inside of a group. In fact, who knows, right? Inside of the Nazi party, people were probably really nice to each other, right?
Oh, yeah. They talked a lot about, the Nazis talked a lot about cooperation. They were building what they called the Volksgemeinschaft, which means the people's community. They were very forthright about we're trying to erase the class struggle. We don't want there to be a class struggle because we want to have unity among the German people. They were all about nationalism and national unity. Yeah.